Royal Guard spots tourist carrying a huge bag, then his heart melts when he noticed something. The autumn wind whistled through the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, carrying with it the familiar scent of rain-dampened stone and wet leaves. James Turner adjusted his bearskin cap for the 100th time that morning, his stoic expression masking the slight discomfort of standing perfectly still for hours. 15 years as a royal guard had taught him that the hardest part wasn't the standing. It was fighting the urge to react to the countless tourists who daily tried to make him break character. But on this particular Wednesday morning, something caught his attention that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Through the corner of his eye, he noticed an elderly gentleman struggling with what appeared to be the most impractical piece of luggage he'd ever seen. The man, who James would later know as Henry Wallace, was barely 5.5 feet tall, yet he wrestled with a suitcase that seemed determined to topple him over. His silver hair was disheveled from the effort, and his wire-rimmed glasses kept sliding down his nose as he attempted to maintain his balance. James watched as Henry approached the palace gates, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he tried to adjust the weight of his burden. The tourist crowd parted around him like water around a rock, some casting curious glances, others too absorbed in their selfies to notice the old man's struggle. Then it happened. The sound of splitting leather cut through the morning air like a gunshot. James saw it unfold in slow motion, the ancient suitcase, it seems finally giving up their long battle against whatever mysterious weight they contained, burst open with the dramatic flare of a firecracker. What exploded out wasn't clothes or souvenirs, but a cascade of envelopes that scattered across the pavement like autumn leaves. For the first time in his 15-year career, James Turner broke protocol. Without thinking, he stepped down from his post, his polished boots clicking against the stone as he moved to help the old man. The tourists gasped, some even applauded, thinking it was part of some special performance. But James wasn't thinking about them. His eyes were fixed on the hundreds of letters now dancing in the wind, threatening to disappear into the busy London streets. "Oh dear," Henry muttered, his voice thick with embarrassment and something else. "Fear? Please, I can't lose them. I can't lose any of them." James began gathering the envelopes, his trained eyes quickly noting something unusual. Each one was different sizes, different shades of aging paper, different handwriting styles evolving over what appeared to be years. But what struck him most was that each one was addressed to a different person, with dates carefully written in the corner. Some looked recent, their paper still crisp and white, while others had yellowed with age, their corners soft and worn from years of handling. As he picked up one particularly old envelope, its paper thin and delicate as tissue, James couldn't help but read the address. Margaret Wallace, 42 Cherry Lane, Bristol, 1973. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words were written with such careful precision that they seemed to carry the weight of something precious. "Those are private," Henry said quietly, then seemed to deflate under the weight of his own words. "Though I suppose after all these years, private is just another word for coward." James looked up, meeting the old man's eyes. There was something in them, a mixture of shame, regret, and desperate hope, that made him want to know more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Henry's face, highlighting every line and wrinkle, each one seeming to tell its own story of words left unsaid. "These are all letters you wrote?" James asked, his voice softer than his usual guard's tone. Henry nodded, kneeling slowly to gather more envelopes, his joints creaking in protest. "Every single one. Letters I should have sent but never did. Words I should have said but couldn't find the courage to speak." He gave a hollow laugh. "Funny how fear can make a man carry his regrets around in a suitcase for decades, isn't it?" As they continued gathering the letters, James noticed the dates spanning years, decades even. Some were addressed to locations across Britain, others to places as far as Australia and Canada. Each envelope seemed to hold a different story, a different moment frozen in time, waiting to be released. "There must be hundreds here," James observed, carefully stacking the collected letters. 417, to be exact," Henry replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Each one a moment I let slip away, each one a sorry I never said, a goodbye I never gave, a truth I never shared." He paused, looking at the stack of letters in his hands. But now I don't have the luxury of time anymore. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting a golden glow over the palace grounds. Around them, tourists continued their photos and tours, oblivious to the profound moment unfolding before them. James found himself holding the last envelope, its address written in shaky handwriting dated just a week ago. As he handed it back to Henry, their eyes met again, and James saw something shift in the old man's expression, a determination breaking through the shame, like sunshine through storm clouds. "Would you?" Henry started, then cleared his throat. "Would you like to know why I'm carrying around 40 years of unsent letters in a broken suitcase?" James glanced at his post, then back at Henry. In 15 years, he'd never abandoned his duty, never broken character, never engaged with a tourist beyond the prescribed protocols. But something about this moment, about these letters, about the raw honesty in Henry's eyes, made him realize that sometimes duty came in different forms. "Yes," James replied, helping Henry to his feet. "Yes, I would." As the morning crowds thinned around Buckingham Palace, Henry carefully placed the gathered letters back into his damaged suitcase, each envelope a physical manifestation of his unspoken words. James found himself transfixed by the old man's methodical movements, the way his fingers lingered on each letter as if touching a precious memory. "You must think I'm quite mad," Henry said, breaking the silence. "A foolish old man carrying around paper ghosts." James shook his head. "No, sir. I think sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry are the words we never said." Henry's eyes misted over as he pulled out one of the letters, its envelope worn at the edges. "This one," he said, his voice trembling, "was meant for my sister Sarah's wedding. I didn't attend because I thought I knew better about the man she was marrying." He let out a bitter laugh. "They celebrated their golden anniversary last spring, and I've spent 50 years being too proud to admit I was wrong." The weight of those words hung in the air between them. James watched as Henry's shoulders seemed to sag under the invisible burden of decades of silence. "It started small, you see," Henry continued, his voice growing stronger as he shared his story. "A missed apology here, an unspoken goodbye there. Each time, I told myself there would be a better moment, a perfect time to say what needed to be said." He gestured to the suitcase. "Before I knew it, I had a collection of perfect moments that never came." A young couple walked past them, hands intertwined, laughing at some private joke. Henry watched them with a mixture of joy and regret. "That's the cruel irony of time, isn't it? When you're young, you think you have an endless supply of it. Then one day, you wake up to find more of it behind you than ahead." James listened intently as Henry revealed how his collection of unsent letters grew over the years. There were letters to childhood friends he'd fallen out with over trivial disputes, now forgotten. Letters to teachers who'd believed in him when he hadn't believed in himself. Letters to neighbors who'd shown kindness during difficult times. "But the hardest ones," Henry said, his voice catching, "are the ones to my son." The admission seemed to physically pain him, and James noticed how Henry's hands trembled as he touched a particular bundle of letters, bound together with a faded blue ribbon. 3 weeks ago, I went to the doctor for what I thought was a persistent cough," Henry continued, looking out across the palace grounds. "Instead, I found out I have stage 4 lung cancer. 6 months, they said. Maybe less." He turned back to James, his eyes clear and determined. "That's when I realized, all these words I've been carrying around, they'll die with me if I don't deliver them now." James felt his throat tighten. As a royal guard, he'd been trained to maintain composure in any situation, but Henry's story struck a personal chord. His own father had walked out 15 years ago, leaving nothing but a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen table. "So you're delivering them all?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Henry nodded, pulling out a creased map marked with red dots. "Every single one. I've been traveling for 2 weeks now, going city to city. Some recipients have moved, some have passed on, but each letter delivered feels like putting down a stone I've been carrying for years." He shared stories of his journey so far, The elderly schoolteacher who burst into tears upon receiving a 40-year-old letter of gratitude, the former colleague who slammed the door in his face only to call him back an hour later for coffee and reconciliation. The hardest part, Henry admitted, isn't facing their anger or disappointment. It's facing the reality that some of these letters will never reach their intended recipients. Time doesn't wait for courage to catch up. A gust of wind rustled the leaves around them, and Henry pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. I spent my whole life avoiding difficult goodbyes, convinced that not saying anything was better than saying the wrong thing. Now I realize that silence can be the cruelest word of all. James thought about his own father, about the questions that still burned in his throat after all these years. "And your son?" he asked quietly. Henry's face crumpled slightly. "Daniel. I have a whole suitcase of letters, but the ones to him, they're the heaviest. I was young, scared of responsibility. Convinced myself they'd be better off without me." He pulled out a photograph, worn and creased, showing a young boy on a swing. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone, I wrote to him. But fear is a prison we build for ourselves, brick by brick, until we can't see a way out anymore." The sound of the changing guard ceremony echoed in the distance, but James remained rooted to the spot, his duty momentarily forgotten in the face of Henry's raw honesty. "That's why this journey is so important," Henry said, carefully returning the photograph to his wallet. "These letters, they're not just words on paper. They're pieces of my soul I've kept locked away for too long. Each one delivered is a chance to set things right, to free both myself and the recipient from the weight of unspoken words." He looked up at James, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You know what the doctors said when they gave me my diagnosis? They said, make peace with your affairs. As if life could be tidied up like a desk drawer." He gestured to the suitcase. "But these are my affairs, these hundreds of moments where I chose silence over truth, safety over courage. And now, finally, I'm choosing differently." The morning had grown warmer, and around them, London continued its busy pace. But in that moment, beside the palace gates, time seemed to stand still as two men, one young, one old, shared the universal understanding of words left unsaid and the courage it takes to finally speak them. "Someone wise once told me," Henry said, preparing to continue his journey, "that regret is the only burden that grows heavier with time." He patted his suitcase gently. "I've carried these long enough. It's time to set them free, even if I'm 40 years too late." James found himself unable to return to his post, drawn into Henry's mission by both duty and a growing personal investment in the old man's journey. They settled on a nearby bench, the damaged suitcase between them, as James offered to help sort through the remaining letters. "We should organize them by location," James suggested, his military precision showing through. "Make the deliveries more efficient." He paused, noticing how Henry's hands hovered protectively over certain envelopes. "Unless there are some you'd prefer to handle personally?" Henry nodded, beginning to separate the letters into neat piles. "London first, then Manchester, Bristol." His voice trailed off as he lifted a pale blue envelope, the paper so delicate it seemed to tremble in the morning light. The name written on it in careful, youthful handwriting made his whole body go still. "Margaret Wallace." James watched as all color drained from Henry's face. "Margaret," he whispered, the name carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of emotion. "I wrote this one the day I left for university. September 15th, 1973. With trembling fingers, Henry traced the carefully written address. She lived in that little house on Cherry Lane, with the red door and the rose bushes her mother planted. His voice took on a distant quality, lost in memories. "I can still see her standing there, waving goodbye as I left for London. I promised I'd write." "And you did," James said gently, gesturing to the letter. "Oh, I wrote it all right." Henry laughed bitterly. "Spent 3 whole days getting every word perfect. Told her everything I should have said that day. How I'd loved her since we were 12, how her smile made the whole world brighter, how I wanted to come back and build a life with her." He swallowed hard. "But I never sent it. Convinced myself she deserved someone better, Someone more worldly than a boy from Bristol with big dreams and empty pockets. James watched as Henry pulled out his phone with shaking hands, his fingers awkwardly navigating to a search engine. I've thought about her every day since. Wondered if she got married, had children, found happiness. His voice caught. I need to know if. The words died in his throat as he stared at the screen. James leaned over, catching sight of an obituary dated 5 years ago. Margaret Wallace, née Peters, beloved mother, grandmother, and friend, passed away peacefully. The phone slipped from Henry's grasp, clattering onto the pavement. James caught him as he swayed, grief etching itself deeper into the lines of his face. 5 years, Henry whispered, his voice raw. I was in London 5 years ago, just streets away from her. I even walked past Cherry Lane, stood there staring at that red door like a ghost from the past. Tears rolled down his cheeks unchecked. All that time, all those chances, and now. James picked up the blue envelope, handling it with the reverence it deserved. The letter inside had never been sealed, as if some part of Henry had always known it would remain undelivered. The paper was soft with age, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still clear, a young man's heart poured onto paper, preserved in time like a fossil in amber. She never married, you know, Henry said suddenly, having gathered himself enough to read more of the obituary. Dedicated her life to teaching, just like she always wanted. The children called her Miss Margaret Wright until the end. He looked up at James, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. She waited. All those years she waited, and I was too much of a coward to even open a door. James sat in silence, understanding the magnitude of this moment. Sometimes the weight of what could have been was heavier than what was. Maybe, James said carefully. Some letters are meant to be read differently. He gestured to the peaceful gardens around them. Maybe this isn't about delivering it to her doorstep anymore. Maybe it's about finally letting the words be heard, even if only by the sky and the trees that knew her. Henry looked at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. With hands that had aged half a century since writing those words, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Dear Margaret, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. As he read, the years seemed to fall away from his face, revealing glimpses of the young man who had poured his heart onto this paper so long ago. He spoke of first meetings and shared dreams, of summer picnics and winter dances, of a love that had lived in his heart unchanged by time. When he finished, the garden had grown quiet, as if nature itself had paused to listen. James noticed that even the tourists seemed to be giving them a respectful distance, perhaps sensing the sanctity of the moment. I always thought not sending this letter was my biggest regret, Henry said finally, carefully folding it back into its envelope. But I was wrong. My biggest regret was letting fear stop me from living the life I dreamed of, the life with her. He touched the obituary on his phone screen one last time. She lived her life fully, bravely. Touched countless lives through her teaching. While I just collected letters in a suitcase. James placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, offering what comfort he could. But you're delivering them now. That counts for something. Henry nodded slowly, tucking Margaret's letter into his breast pocket, close to his heart. Yes, I suppose it does. He looked at the remaining letters with renewed determination. And I won't let fear stop me anymore. There's one more letter that can't wait, one that should have been delivered 25 years ago. James knew without asking which letter Henry meant. The one to his son Daniel, the heaviest burden in his suitcase of regrets. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as Henry began delivering letters to London addresses. James, having arranged coverage for his post, accompanied him, watching as each delivery unfolded like a chapter in an unfinished book. The first was to a retired professor living in Kensington. The elderly academic had stared at Henry for a full minute before recognition dawned, followed by tears and a fierce embrace. I always knew you'd do great things. Henry read from the decades-old letter, his voice shaking. You saw potential in me when I couldn't see it myself. Not all reunions were as warm. At a townhouse in Chelsea, a gray-haired woman listened to Henry's letter of apology for a betrayed confidence 40 years ago, then quietly closed the door without a word. But even then, Henry stood straighter, as if the mere act of speaking his truth had lightened his burden. As the day wore on, James noticed Henry's growing agitation. After each delivery, he would touch his jacket pocket, where a particular envelope seemed to burn like a hot coal against his chest. "Tell me about him," James said finally, as they rested on a park bench between deliveries. "Your son." Henry pulled out the envelope, cream-colored, thick with multiple pages, the address written and rewritten so many times the paper was nearly transparent in spots. "Daniel," he said, the name carrying years of regret. "He'd be 32 now." "What happened?" James asked gently. Henry's fingers traced the sealed edge of the envelope. "I was 25 when he was born. Young, ambitious, terrified. His mother Claire, she was amazing, strong, patient, everything I wasn't. But I..." He closed his eyes, the pain of memory etching deeper lines in his face. "I convinced myself I wasn't ready, that I'd be a terrible father, that they deserved better." James listened as Henry described the night he left, a coward's exit in the pre-dawn hours, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note. "I started writing to him that same day," Henry continued. "Every birthday, every Christmas. Pages and pages of explanations, apologies, things I should have said face to face. But you never sent them." "No." Henry's laugh was hollow. "I told myself I was protecting him. The truth is, I was protecting myself. From rejection, from judgment, from the reality of what I'd done." He pulled out his phone, showing James a social media profile. "I found him online last year. He's a teacher now, married, has 2 little girls of his own." The profile showed a smiling man with Henry's eyes, surrounded by a beautiful family. "He looks happy," James observed. "He does." Henry's voice cracked. "No thanks to me. I missed everything, his first steps, his graduations, his wedding. I have grandchildren I've never met." He clutched the letter tighter. "How do you apologize for 30 years of absence in a single letter?" James thought of his own father, of the questions that still burned in his throat. "Maybe the letter isn't meant to fix everything," he said slowly. "Maybe it's just meant to be a beginning." Henry nodded, then suddenly froze, staring at his phone. "He's here," he whispered. "What?" "Daniel. He lives in London now. According to his profile, he teaches at a primary school in Greenwich." Henry's hands began to shake. I could actually. You could deliver it in person," James finished quietly. The color drained from Henry's face. "I can't. What right do I have to walk into his life now? After all these years?" James leaned forward, his voice firm. "What right do you have to keep denying him the truth? To let your shame rob him of the chance to make his own choice about forgiveness?" The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Henry stared at the letter in his hands, decades of unspoken words pressing against the seams of the envelope. "He might slam the door in my face," Henry whispered. "He might," James agreed. "But he might not. And isn't that possibility worth facing your fear?" Henry was quiet for a long moment, looking at the remaining letters in his suitcase. Each one represented a moment of courage too long delayed, a truth too long hidden. Finally, he looked up at James, determination replacing fear in his eyes. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "I don't think I can do this alone." James thought of his post at the palace, of protocols and duties. Then he thought of his own father, of doors never opened and words never spoken. "Yes," he said. "I'll come." They found Daniel's address, a modest house with a small garden where children's toys lay scattered on the lawn. Henry stood at the gate, frozen, his letter clutched in trembling hands. "What if he hates me?" he whispered. "What if he doesn't?" James countered gently. With each step up the garden path, Henry seemed to age backwards and forwards simultaneously, the young father who ran away merging with the old man seeking redemption. At the door, he paused one final time, looking down at the letter that had waited 30 years to be delivered. "You know," he said quietly, "I've imagined this moment thousands of times. In my dreams, I always know exactly what to say." "Sometimes," James replied. "The words we've carried the longest are the ones that need to be spoken the most." Henry nodded, took a deep breath, and raised his hand to knock. The sound echoed like thunder in the quiet afternoon, each rap another nail in the coffin of 3 decades of silence. As footsteps approached from inside, James watched Henry straighten his shoulders, clutching his letter like a shield against the past. In that moment, he saw not just an old man facing his greatest regret, but every person who had ever wished for one more chance to make things right. The door began to open. The door opened to reveal a tall man with Henry's eyes and his mother's gentle features. Daniel Wallace stood in the doorway, one hand still on the handle, his expression shifting from polite inquiry to confusion to slow, dawning recognition. "Can I help?" he began, then stopped. Something ancient and unspoken passed between father and son, a current of recognition that transcended the decades of separation. Time seemed to compress and expand in that moment. Behind Daniel, the sounds of children's laughter floated from somewhere inside the house, and the scent of freshly baked cookies wafted through the doorway. Such ordinary moments made the extraordinary nature of this reunion even more profound. "Daniel!" Henry's voice cracked on the name, as if speaking it aloud had broken something loose inside him. I know who you are," Daniel said quietly. His voice was neither warm nor cold, but carried the weight of 32 years of questions. "I've seen your picture often enough in Mum's old albums." Henry's hands trembled as he held out the envelope, its edges worn soft from decades of handling. I wrote this. There are so many of them, actually. One for every birthday, every Christmas." He swallowed hard. "Not that it makes any difference now." Daniel stared at the envelope, making no move to take it. Behind him, a child's voice called out, "Daddy, who's at the door?" "Just a moment, sweetheart," Daniel called back, his eyes never leaving Henry's face. To James, who stood quietly supportive at Henry's side, the tension was almost unbearable. "I don't expect forgiveness," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never stop thinking about you. Not a single day. But I know that doesn't change anything. He couldn't bring himself to mention the cancer, not yet. "I needed you to know that leaving wasn't about you. It was never about you." Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe. 32 years, he said, his voice controlled but trembling slightly. 32 years of wondering if I wasn't enough. If I did something wrong. If you ever thought about me at all. Every day," Henry repeated, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "Every single day." A small figure appeared behind Daniel, a little girl of about 6, with curious eyes and her grandmother's smile. "Daddy?" she asked, peering around his legs at the crying stranger on their doorstep. Something shifted in Daniel's expression as he looked down at his daughter, then back at his father. Perhaps he saw himself in her eyes, or recognized the weight of fatherhood in a way that helped him understand, if not forgive, the choices of the past. Slowly, he reached out and took the letter. The envelope opened with a whisper of aged paper. Daniel's eyes moved across the pages, years of unspoken words finally finding their audience. His hands began to shake slightly as he read, and James noticed tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "You wrote this when I graduated primary school," Daniel said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you know I won the spelling competition?" "Your mother," Henry admitted. "I called her every year on your birthday. She'd tell me everything, your awards, your football matches, your first girlfriend. I was a coward in every way except loving you from afar." Daniel looked up from the letter, his expression complex with emotions too tangled to name. "Did she know you were writing these letters?" Henry shook his head. "No one knew. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving this world without you knowing that you were loved. That you were wanted. That every day of silence was a choice made from fear, not from lack of love." Leaving this world? Daniel's eyes narrowed, really taking in his father's appearance for the first time, the gauntness, the pallor beneath his skin. Are you? 6 months, Henry said quietly. Maybe less. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children inside seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their play growing quiet. Then, slowly, Daniel stepped forward. His arms opened, almost against his will, and he pulled his father into an embrace that spanned 3 decades of absence. Henry's sob was muffled against his son's shoulder, years of carefully constructed walls crumbling in an instant. "I'm so sorry," Henry whispered, the words he'd written 1,000 times finally spoken aloud. "I'm so sorry." "I know," Daniel said, his own tears falling now. "I know." James watched as father and son held each other, seeing in their reunion the possibility of healing his own broken relationship. The little girl still stood in the doorway, watching with wide eyes as her father cried in the arms of a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all. "Would you like to come in?" Daniel asked finally, pulling back to wipe his eyes. "Meet your granddaughters? Sophie here has been dying to know who you are, and Emily's just woken from her nap." Henry looked at his son in disbelief, hope blooming across his tear-stained face. "I'd like that very much," he managed to say. As Daniel led them inside, James started to step back, feeling like an intruder on this private moment. But Henry caught his arm. "Please," the old man said quietly. "Stay. You helped make this possible." So James followed them into the warm house, watching as 32 years of separation began to mend, one moment at a time. He thought of his own father, and the letter that still waited to be written. Perhaps, he realized, it was never too late for courage to find its voice. The evening sun cast long shadows across King's Cross Station as Henry prepared for the final leg of his journey. After spending precious hours with Daniel and his family, time that felt both infinite and too brief, he stood on the platform with his battered suitcase considerably lighter than before. James had accompanied him, still in his guard uniform, drawing curious glances from passing travelers. But neither man paid attention to the onlookers. They were bound now by something deeper than circumstance. "They want me to move in with them," Henry said quietly, still seeming dazed by the afternoon's events. "Daniel and Sarah, that's his wife. They have a guest room, and with the treatments." He trailed off, touching his chest where the weight of unopened letters had rested for so long. "Will you?" James asked, though he already knew the answer from the light in Henry's eyes. "Yes." Henry smiled, the expression transforming his tired face. "Sophie, my granddaughter, she already started planning where we'll put my books. And little Emily." He shook his head in wonder. "She climbed right into my lap, called me grandpa without a second thought. Children have such open hearts, don't they?" The station announcer called out departure times, the echoing voice bouncing off the Victorian arches above them. Henry glanced at his ticket, then reached into his suitcase one last time. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a sealed envelope. James stared at it, his heart suddenly pounding. The envelope was cream-colored, pristine, clearly new. His name was written on the front in Henry's careful handwriting. "It's not from me," Henry explained gently. "It's for your father." James's hand trembled slightly as he took the envelope. "I don't understand. When you told me about him, about how he left, about the note on the kitchen table, I saw myself. Another coward who chose silence over truth." Henry placed a weathered hand on James's shoulder. "But you also showed me that it's never too late to break that silence. I wouldn't even know where to find him." James protested weakly. Henry smiled. "The return address is on the back. I did a little research while you were getting us tea this afternoon. He's in Manchester. Has been for the past decade." James turned the envelope over, seeing the neatly printed address. His father, so close all these years, yet separated by more than just miles. "I can't," he whispered. "You can't," Henry said firmly. "Because you already have. You showed me how. Every word of encouragement you gave me, every moment you stood by my side today, you were showing yourself the way forward too. The weight of the envelope in James's hands felt like it contained more than just paper. It held possibility, fear, hope, all the complicated emotions that came with facing the past. "What did you write?" he asked. "Nothing," Henry replied. "The envelope is empty. The words have to be yours, James. Your truth, your terms." He patted his chest where Daniel's letter had rested for so many years. "Trust me, the right words will come when you're ready to write them." The final boarding call for Henry's train echoed through the station. Around them, people rushed to and fro, each caught up in their own stories of arrivals and departures. "Thank you," James said suddenly, pulling Henry into a fierce embrace. "For showing me that it's never too late." Henry hugged him back, his frame feeling stronger somehow than it had that morning. "Thank you for helping me deliver my last letters. For giving me back my son." As Henry boarded the train, James stood at attention, offering a formal salute that carried all the respect and affection he couldn't put into words. Henry smiled, understanding the gesture for what it was, one man of honor recognizing another. The train pulled away from the platform, carrying Henry toward his new life with Daniel and his family, toward whatever time he had left, now rich with the possibility of love and redemption. James remained on the platform long after the train disappeared from view, holding the empty envelope that held so much promise. Finally, he pulled out his phone and looked at the address again. With fingers that shook only slightly, he began to type. "Dear Dad, I'm ready to listen if you're ready to talk." The message sent with a soft whoosh, carrying with it years of unspoken words. As James walked out of the station, still in his guard uniform, he felt lighter somehow. Above him, the London sky was turning to dusk, that magical time when endings and beginnings blur together. In his pocket, the empty envelope waited to be filled with words that had taken 15 years to find their voice. But thanks to an old man with a suitcase full of letters, James finally understood that some silences were meant to be broken, some distances meant to be bridged, and it was never too late to write a new ending to an old story. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a response already. James took a deep breath, thinking of Henry's courage, of Daniel's forgiveness, of the power of words finally spoken. Then, standing tall like the guard he was, James opened the message and began to read, ready at last for whatever words waited on the other side of 15 years of silence.